Do we have Max Blumenthal on? Oh. Oh, there is. Hi, Max. It's good to see you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me? My audio should be on.
Yeah, now you're good. Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for attending. We really appreciate your time. I really wanted to ask you first, though, about how you see, or how you reflect now on what happened after October 7th. Because, again, when most conflicts start, we always get the same picture. This is a black and white story. We had this liberal democracy in Israel being attacked by terrorists, unprovoked, obviously. And we had stories about beheaded babies, all of this. But now, of course, going 15, 16 months into this, what do we know actually happened afterwards, after 7th of October?
Well, it's a very open-ended question, what happened after, because we're 15 months on now. But one thing that happened, just to tie on to your remarks that I was listening to, is the rules-based order was exposed as a gigantic hoax. Obviously, there's a state of exception around anything that takes place inside Palestine. And we saw the mask lift in our own society with Israeli control or Zionist control over major institutions just exposed in ways like never before. Now, one of those institutions was U.S. corporate media. U.S. corporate media functioned as the mighty Wurlitzer for Benjamin Netanyahu's office immediately after October 7th. All context was erased for the Al-Aqsa flood operation. All history was disappeared, and suddenly Israel was a collection of Holocaust victims. And we were treated to a series of deceptions which created space for Israel to be able to carry out a genocide, which, as I tried to explain in my 2013 book, Goliath, was long in the offing. Israel was a society that was primed for genocide. And the 2014 assault on the Gaza Strip was a test run, an assault I got to witness from inside Gaza. So the first deceptions, as you mentioned, were about beheaded babies rolled out on CNN with absolutely no critical detachment. The CNN reporter claimed that these reports were confirmed by the Prime Minister's office. So they were confirmed by one of the world's biggest liars. Then we heard about baby baked in an oven, baby cut out from a pregnant woman's ovaries, and on and on. Every single one of these claims was totally discredited. In fact, only one baby was killed on October 7th, 11-month-old Mila Cohen, by accident, shot through a safe room door. The real objectives of October 7th were completely erased. This is what the US media does. It's what it did when Russia invaded Ukraine. We were simply told Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. There is no political logic behind it at all, and no context, no provocation. And here we were told Hamas simply wants to kill Jews. So Israel had all the space it needed to commit genocide. And it was also thanks to the Biden administration's, the main propagator of the rhetoric of the rules-based order, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, that it was granted that space. On October 31st, 2023, at a very key moment, when Hamas was telling Israel through the Doha, through a line that had been established in Doha negotiation, back-channel negotiation, that it would release all hostages in exchange for Israel not invading Gaza, and they were putting forward prisoner lists already. Tony Blinken went before the Senate and was asked during his testimony, why don't you push for a ceasefire? And he said, because Hamas went into a living room in Kibbutz Be'eri and tortured a family to death, dismembering the parents, then killing the children, then they had lunch in the living room. This was a complete fabrication told by a discredited figure in Israel who is behind so many of these lies. Yossi Landau from a ultra-Orthodox quote-unquote rescue organization that was raising money off of October 7th fabrications. And Blinken said, this is why we cannot have a ceasefire, because we're dealing with monsters in Hamas and Israel needs to be able to destroy them. So that was October 31st. Another deal was put forward in May that Hamas accepted in May 2024. And that deal was put forward by the Biden administration after the International Court of Justice had accused Israel of genocide, ordered it to stop, and ordered it not to invade Rafah, the southern area in Gaza where so many displaced Palestinians were living in tents. And so the Biden administration puts this ceasefire deal on the table, expecting Hamas to reject it, so that they can kind of deflect from the ICJ decision. Hamas accepts it unexpectedly, and so Israel moves the goalposts, and the Biden administration allows Israel to blame Hamas for the talks falling apart. In July, again, the same ceasefire deal is put on the table. Hamas accepts all terms. Israel moves the goalposts again. Netanyahu puts new terms on the table that are impossible to meet. Behind the scenes, the fanatical security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is telling Netanyahu that if you don't sabotage these ceasefire negotiations, I will quit your coalition and your coalition will fall apart. Netanyahu is facing 4 corruption trials, so he needs to keep his coalition together. So he's consistently sabotaging the deals. And it looked like he had some kind of backroom agreement with Tony Blinken, where the U.S. would agree to blame the Palestinians every single time the ceasefire deal fell apart. So fast forward to today, we got a ceasefire deal after, let's say, 60,000 dead in Gaza, total destruction, over 80% of homes destroyed. And Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister who served for most of the genocide in Gaza, recently gave this past week an interview to Israel's Channel 12, where he declared that the deal that was on the table in July that Hamas accepted was the same exact deal that Israel just agreed to provide a cessation of the conflict. And he said thousands of lives were wasted and the hostages are still left in the Gaza Strip. They could have been out in July. So that's where we are today, just looking at completely needless death. Today, the Netzarim corridor was cleared, or I should say in the last 24 hours, the Netzarim corridor was fully abandoned by the Israeli military. The Netzarim corridor was a de facto Israeli military base in Gaza that was to have cut off the north of Gaza. It cuts clear across the Gaza Strip. It was to have cut off the north from the rest of the Gaza Strip. Israeli soldiers were basically living in there. They were having barbecues, rest and recreation, massages, and they were staging massacres from there and sniping at people in Gaza. The whole point was to prevent the population of the north of Gaza from being able to go back to their homes by having this base there. Because of the ceasefire in stage 2, they were forced to leave. The soldiers were crying. They were so unhappy to leave. Now they're gone, and people in Gaza are able to survey the ruins left behind in Netzarim. And they found, you can see this on Twitter if you actually look for it right now. Decapitated heads, fairly recently decapitated heads, arms, legs, Body parts were scattered throughout this area where Israeli soldiers were having barbecues, while the US administration was blocking ceasefire after ceasefire. The Israeli soldiers were dismembering human beings in Gaza for no reason at all except sheer sadism. So going back to the beginning of my remarks, who is at fault here? Of course, the US administration, of course, Israel and its project of Greater Israel, besieging the Palestinian people, expelling them, as we hear from Donald Trump's remarks, but also the US media provided Israel with all of the space it needed to be able to carry out this barbaric project. And we're just beginning to see the true graphic visual evidence of the horrors that Israel committed, because they have now finally left large parts of Gaza.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the media, because often this kind of war crimes can't really be committed unless you have some cover, both from the political class as well as the media. I was curious about the ceasefire, because you brought up. To what extent do you see this as being sustainable, or will it endure? I'm thinking, obviously, Netanyahu, well, he doesn't hide it, he doesn't care for it. The Israeli government could collapse if they actually uphold it. On the other hand, breaching it now will also come at a high cost. How do you see the likelihood or the ability of the ceasefire to be preserved?
Well, the ceasefire can only be preserved with US pressure on Israel. Israel has very little incentive for maintaining it. It was expected by all my contacts in Gaza that it would fall apart. And in the last 48 hours, 3 captives were released from Gaza. And unlike in the previous rounds, when captives were released, the female Israeli soldiers who were released, these ones appeared gaunt, not very well fed. They were not well fed because no one in the concentration camp that Israel created, called Gaza, was being well fed. But in Israeli media, the way it's being portrayed is that they were tortured, they were treated horribly, and that this is the Holocaust all over again, that Israel was created to prevent Jews from ever appearing gaunt and being held in the captivity of Gentile hands. And here we have failed. And the only way to redress this situation and to continue to perpetuate the spiritual memory of the Holocaust is to totally destroy Hamas. But what are we seeing at the same time in the Gaza Strip? We're seeing large processions, parades even, of the Al-Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas. They look to be in pretty good shape. They're armed still. They're standing tall in the streets of Gaza. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, former Secretary of State Tony Blinken, former President Joe Biden both acknowledged that Hamas had replenished the ranks of its fighters by the end of the war. So Israel has failed in this objective, and yet the population sees Hamas as the new Nazis who have abused their population. And the way Jewish Israeli society digested the last 15 months is completely different from the way we did, the way those of you at this conference did. They saw the hostages and captives in Gaza as a kind of like football team. And everybody knew the names of every player on the team, and they knew the family members. Israel's a very small society. Everyone kind of knows each other through army service, or they know someone who knows someone. And their obsession with getting these people out transcended any empathy they might have had for the thousands of children who were butchered by their jets. So, I see a very high potential for these, the emotional pressure to start to push Israel back into the conflict. There's so, and the Trump administration, while it wanted this ceasefire deal as a political win for Trump, while it needs to prevent the conflict from expanding for now, because Donald Trump doesn't seem to want a war with Iran right now. There is very little they're doing to exert leverage on Israel. Donald Trump's State Department, under Marco Rubio, who is a neoconservative pet project, just authorized an $8 billion arms sales deal to Israel. The Donald Trump Treasury Department just lifted sanctions on a small handful of violent, fanatical settlers in the West Bank, who the Biden administration had sanctioned as one of their few token acts of pressure on Israel. And that has unleashed settler violence across the West Bank on Palestinians, as well as sending a message to the Israeli military that it has a free hand to attack Palestinians in the north of the West Bank, where there has been armed resistance, and now there's a major Israeli military operation there. Then we have Lebanon. Israel has been attacking in the north of Lebanon, all around Lebanon in recent days, in order to bait and taunt Hezbollah into responding and to keep pressure on the axis of resistance, because Israel feels like it got the upper hand by the time it signed a ceasefire in Lebanon, and it wants to keep maintaining the upper hand. The Trump administration sent a very bizarre figure to Lebanon named Morgan Ortagus, who is a State Department official who's actually a convert to Judaism, a Christian Zionist convert to Judaism, to meet with Joseph Aoun, the new president of Lebanon. And it doesn't seem like things went well there, because the new Lebanese government, which the US was pushing for, has allowed Shia politicians connected to Hezbollah and the Amal movement into government, explicitly rejecting what the US wanted. So I think Lebanon could be the first place where the ceasefire fails, and then that could spread again to Gaza. Israel feels like it wasn't able to finish its job in Yemen, and Yemen was a test run for Iran, which is obviously the ultimate objective. Israel believes, true or not, and it has sent the message to the world that it destroyed Iran's anti-aircraft systems, its S-300 batteries, during its last attack on Iran. Iran did not respond to that. We don't know what the truth is there, but it believes that it can actually now have a clear path to attacking Israel's nuclear facilities. And my understanding is that is the message that it is sending to National Security Council Director Mike Waltz, who has been a fervent advocate for striking Iran. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, is an open opponent of striking Iran. Where Donald Trump falls on this is unclear. Tucker Carlson, who's an influencer in the Trump orbit, is a very vehement opponent of attacking Iran. But I think the momentum is still there for reigniting this conflict, attacking Iran, and there are forces in the U.S. administration that want to remove all constraints on Israel. It's completely up to the U.S. administration whether this conflict can reignites, because I believe Netanyahu wants to go straight for Iran with U.S. help.
Yeah, it's interesting with Iran, because this is really the dilemma. If they do not retaliate, then they're weak and they can be taken out. If they do retaliate, then they're aggressive and dangerous, and they also have to be taken out. So they do have a difficult way in responding. But you mentioned that the ceasefire and whether or not Israel will go to war with Iran, it all depends on the United States. And well, I guess everyone's familiar with Trump's recent statements about the need to clean out Palestinians from Gaza. When he asks how many, he said all of them. And also, of course, arguing that the United States should then seize ownership of Gaza. And yeah, it would be been interesting. I'm never sure if you take him literally, but this would more or less merge United States interest with that of Israel. Although I tend to doubt this can actually be done. I don't see how it could be, but it also seems to conflict with this idea of America first, given that this is very hard to convince, I guess, Americans how this would benefit their security. But what are you reading into Trump's comments about cleaning out Gaza? Is this all bluster, or how do you read his comments?
well, it's very dangerous bluster, but it's bluster nonetheless. And it's bluster based on actual proposals that have been put before Trump, complete with AI rendered graphics showing the utopia of Gaza after its population is ethnically cleansed and it's leveled out and redeveloped by retrograde Arab monarchies like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. There's someone named Joseph Peltzman, who is a professor at George Washington University's Elliott School, which, for those of you who don't know, is located right across the street from the State Department in Washington. It's a training ground for State Department apparatchiks. And Peltzman is actually a professor there who put forward a Gaza, quote unquote, relocation plan for Donald Trump last July when Gaza was substantially destroyed. And the Trump team accepted his proposal and said, this is very interesting, we'll look into it. You know, you're thinking outside the box. And what Peltzman said in this proposal is you have to destroy all of Gaza and restart from scratch. So it's almost identical to the language that Donald Trump kind of regurgitated out in cretinous fashion in his press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu. There are other plans Netanyahu has uploaded to his website and PowerPoint presentations that pretty much call for the same thing. One of them is called Gaza 2035. I discussed it on our Gray Zone live stream, I think yesterday. Kind of lose track of when I do these live streams. But what Donald Trump did was he sort of reviewed these plans. Donald Trump's mind is not the most acute. And then he tries to market them in a really crude way. And it sounded like ethnic cleansing, and because it was. Israel is never going to allow a portion of the population of Gaza out and then allow them back in. Why? Because it contradicts the objectives of Zionism. Zionism requires that Israel outbreed the Palestinian indigenous Muslim and Christian population in order to maintain a Jewish state. If it fails to do that and fails to maintain a superior number of Jews over non-Jews between the river and the sea, well, it just becomes officially an apartheid state. It is. It already is. But the whole point of Gaza was to create a human warehouse for the surplus population that could not come, that were all refugees from what is now Israel, that could not come back to Israel, because then you'd have a very small minority population ruling over non-Jews in its midst while declaring itself a Jewish state. So it could no longer be Jewish and democratic if that population was living among them. So they have to live in a warehouse, a concentration camp, and then they have to disengage from it and declare that they have no responsibility for that population. That's what Israel did in 2005, 2006 with the disengagement. The Geneva Conventions no longer apply. They're not occupying them because they're not physically there. Of course, they're maintaining total control over Gaza through panopticon, more sophisticated means, drones and walls and so on. The point of that is setting the stage at a later date for pushing that population onto the Arab world, onto Egypt specifically, but letting them out anywhere. And now Israel has the perfect opportunity to start to push that surplus population out in order to secure its Jewish demographic majority. And Joseph Peltzman, who appears to be himself a Jewish Zionist who's embedded in academia, doesn't face the same consequences that pro-Palestine professors face when they blurt out free Palestine or question what Israel did on October 7th and they all get fired. He's putting forward this plan that seems like the perfect plan. And Donald Trump, he understands on which side his bread is buttered. Donald Trump was funded by Elon Musk. We all know that. $185 million to fund Donald Trump's ground game in the 2024 campaign. But his second largest funder was Miriam Adelson, the widow of the late Zionist American warlord Sheldon Adelson. Miriam Adelson is completely committed to the project of Greater Israel. She's basically an Israeli intelligence asset. she also funded the career of Benjamin Netanyahu. And she was seated during Trump's inauguration directly behind Donald Trump. No member of Congress got a seat that good. Most of the cabinet members were not treated to such a VIP seat. So Miriam Adelson's importance is seminal, and Trump understands what he has to say here. So he basically delivered Israel's fantasy to them, at least rhetorically. And it was bluster, because the population of Gaza will not leave. They will fight to stay in their homes. We saw the kind of courage and steadfastness they displayed in northern Gaza when they were under a starvation siege for the past several months. The doctor at Kamal Adwan Hospital, Hussam Abu Sofia, who stayed with his patients and refused orders to evacuate the hospital until he was arrested and taken to a torture camp by Israel. That's the mentality of the people of Gaza, because they understand the moment they leave their homes, Palestine disappears. Their identity as a people disappears, and the genocide is complete. And as I mentioned before, Hamas's armed wing is still active. So it's bluster, but what Trump has done is he has legitimized this kind of bluster. And now you're seeing, for example, the New York Times declare that Trump was putting forward an out-of-the-box idea that breaks with conventions in how to resolve the conflict. We're seeing like Dennis Ross. He's someone who oversaw the so-called peace process and negotiations under the Clinton administration and had a role in the Obama administration. He said, well, all these Arab states are criticizing Trump's plan, but do they have a better idea? Murdoch media in Australia and the UK hyped up Trump's plan, as some kind of bold initiative. So we can see now the way that Trump operates is he'll say something that seems to be crazy, but it shifts the parameters and the Overton window and makes it seem more normal over time. So he's normalizing ethnic cleansing. And just one final point, Donald Trump's movement is called America. It operates under the motto of America First, make America great again. But it's very clear here that Donald Trump is being subverted by a foreign force in Israel and its Greater Israel lobby and Zionist movement inside the United States, and that he was actually initially willing to commit U.S. troops to, in his words, take ownership over Gaza. And so it raises some questions for his base about what America First really means, what American interests truly are, whether they're actually aligned with Israel. And the contradictions are beginning to sharpen for a lot of the more informed members of Donald Trump's movement, and they're starting to question if they might have been scammed. And this will be an interesting trend to watch for the next 4 years.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that this plan of sending them to other countries was probably not very well informed. And obviously the Palestinians would very much resist this. He suggested, why would they want to go back, as if they were pretty much already agreeing with him that they should all be ethnically cleansed. But in terms of sending to other countries, there's some challenges there. I guess it's Egypt and Jordan. What happens to these countries within the countries? Just not that this would necessarily or actually happen, but just the threat of sending or ethnically cleansing Palestine and sending all these people to Jordan and Egypt. Not only just these two countries, but even Saudi Arabia, by Trump suggesting that he already got the green light from the Saudis. This could be true. I would probably doubt it, but nonetheless, among the public, this can't be a very popular statement, something that would make them very happy with their authorities.
No, this is from the perspective of the Sunni Arab states. It's the equivalent of threatening them with a bombing campaign. Prince Turki Al Faisal, who is the longtime intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia, a very close ally of the CIA, appeared on Christiane Amanpour's program on PBS in the U.S. I think it was PBS. It might have been CNN. Wearing a headdress, wearing a Palestinian kufiya as his headdress, basically sending a signal to Trump of total defiance. King Abdullah in Jordan, who is basically a British implant in the region, Hashemite, who rules over a large population of Palestinian refugees, leaked to the media that he's preparing military action against Israel if Palestinians are ethnically cleansed and pushed into Jordan. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, another kind of Western-backed, effectively a Western-backed stooge, totally dependent on the West to rule, and on the Camp David Accords, on U.S. aid for his military, at the head of a de facto military junta in Egypt, has declared total opposition and rejection of Trump's plan. The Egyptian people, the average Egyptian, is very strongly supportive of the Palestinian struggle, but the Egyptian elite is deeply anti-Palestinian and sees Palestinians as a destabilizing force. Sisi is deeply concerned about another Muslim Brotherhood insurgency or uprising in his country, and sees Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood as at least ideological cousins. Jordan saw destabilizing protests in Amman throughout the war that I think frightened King Abdullah. And, we also should consider the situation in Lebanon. Palestinian refugees there were actually stripped of their employment, of the ability to gain employment in something like 75 professions by Rafiq Hariri, the late Sunni pro-Western leader of the Future Party. Back in 2005, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are treated horribly by Lebanese society. The broader Lebanese society, with all of its sectarian divisions, is very unstable. And so adding more Palestinian refugees into the region just creates a tinderbox. So the Arab leaders, as submissive as they are to Western leadership, are just dead set against this. And I don't think Donald Trump understands that, as he just accepts the Zionist logic and the Zionist proposal for every problem. Then you have Europe. I mean, Europe's moving to the right. One of the reasons is it was part of the, thesis for my last book, The Management of Savagery, on why Europe was moving to the right, was Syria. That the West had funded a dirty war and oversaw a dirty war in Syria for 10 years, created one of the largest migration outflows since World War II. Germany accepted 1 million Syrian refugees. All these other countries were concerned that they would have Syrian refugees in their midst. A majority of Brexit voters listed immigration or the migrant crisis as one of the reasons they voted for Brexit. And now we're starting to see the effect with the AfD in Germany rising, all of these populist right-wing movements rising. They're not going to accept Palestinian refugees the way that the way the EU accepted Syrian refugees. So where do they go? They go to their homes. Why can't we just affirm that they should go to their homes? And then what about the Israeli population, the Jewish Israeli population that is still displaced? Something like 50,000 Jewish Israelis are refusing to go back home to the north of Israel because their homes many of them are destroyed, and they're afraid of the reignited conflict with Hezbollah. Where would they go? I don't know. Since Donald Trump has legitimized all of this talk about ethnically cleansing Palestinians and transfer and relocation, why not send that population for a period of time until their homes are rebuilt to Germany, which authored the Holocaust and got off cheap by displacing this sort of. Why doesn't Germany take on this problem that it helped create? it got off cheap with Zionism and displaced its quote unquote Jewish problem onto the backs of Palestinians who had nothing to do with the Holocaust. So these are questions that now can be asked thanks to the cretinous bluster of Donald Trump.
Thank you, Max. By the way, I just have one last brief question. I know it's not popular to try to look into our crystal balls and predict the future, but given that there's a lot of possible or positive directions which are being blocked, how do you see this conflict playing out in the time to come? Do you have any expectations?
Well, I think I addressed that after the second question. And I don't like to look into a crystal ball, but I'm really concerned about what's happening right now in Washington and the agenda of National Security Council Director Mike Waltz vis-a-vis Iran. And I think the ceasefire is essentially a pause in a protracted conflict that was put on overdrive by the Al-Aqsa flood operation. What Yahya Sinwar did by authorizing or carrying out that operation was just accelerate the forces of history. And so we're living through that historical period right now. And Israel would like to reshape the region according to its own designs, but there are still various resistance forces that have the power to push back. And the strongest force is Iran. So it has its eyes set on an attack on Iran's nuclear sites this year. And once again, it's up to the US.
Oh, that was a good time to finish. So thank you so much to Max, if he's not listening. Thanks.
You will find much more from these two guys on YouTube, but also Substack, writings, there are books galore. This is a fantastic hour. Thank you. We don't want to, and thank you.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.